Good evening. Wow, these lights are bright. I can't see any of you from up here, but I know you're out there. So welcome again. We're about to get started with the presentation. Just a moment. You could find a seat. We'll get started here in about 30 seconds. All right, good evening again, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Mo Wright with Raymond Consulting. We are about to get the presentation for the Short Enough Parking Plan underway. As many of you have been with us, I see a lot of familiar faces from the process here tonight, so thank you so much for continuing to stay in this journey with us. Tonight we'll be sharing how the plan has evolved since our first series of public engagement activities. You'll get a chance to hear where the plan currently stands as it moves toward implementation, as well as we'll also offer an opportunity for some Q&A toward the end about the plan as it stands today. Just by way of housekeeping, for restrooms, if you'll exit the back of the auditorium to the right, you'll see a sign for restrooms. If you just follow that around, there are facilities there for your use. We're scheduled tonight to conclude around 7:30, so we'll be here just over another hour from now, and so I wanted you to know that. And then as you came in, you had a few things that were handed to you. The green card is going to be for questions later, but you can submit those at any point in the course of the conversation. We're not going to take questions until Robert's done with the presentation, but feel free to hand those cards. We'll have folks from our team roaming the aisles, hand them to those folks. They'll start to categorize them, group them together, and then we'll pose those questions after the presentation is done. What we found over this process is that many of you, your questions will get answered as the presentation moves forward, but we're certainly welcome to answer any of those about the process or the questions itself. You also have a plan overview document that has on the new map. That looks a little different than the last time you probably saw it, and so that has been a result of some of the feedback we've gotten, so we'll get into that just a little bit later, but I wanted you to know everything you had. You also have, and this is not directly related, but very much a cousin project to this planning effort, which is the Short Enough Streetscape project. So we did give you some information about all of the current construction that's happening around the High Street Scape project is here for you as well, so feel free to take that information back for you and any of your constituents or family members. We hope that you will distribute that widely for us as well. Okay, so again, Mo Wright with Raymond. I want to talk a little bit about just where we've been thus far before Robert comes and kind of starts to give you where the plan exists today. Basically, three purposes today. I'll hit the engagement process we've engaged in over these last several months really quickly. We'll talk about, Robert will come then and talk about the plan elements as they exist today, what the current plan that's moving toward implementation will look like, and the timelines associated with that. We'll discuss next steps in the process, where we're going from tonight's meeting and what that process will look like, and then we'll have opportunity to address some of your questions that you might have after his presentation. So that's kind of our working agenda tonight. Many of you have seen this before, so I won't spend a lot of time here. You know that we had pretty much a three-phase process of coming up with the current recommended plan. We started with some data collection activities, and as I said, many of you were involved in early focus groups about this. Many of you took the survey, over 1,000 of you took the survey. So we've had a lot of feedback over this process, and that's been really important to help us get to the plan as it stands today. We've also had a series of meetings that were open to all residents and stakeholders. And so you saw we kicked off with convening our task force. That is a select group of individuals who represent a broad spectrum of stakeholders in the area. They have met twice and have helped us to refine even further the data and the information you all have given us. So let's thank our task force for the work they've done. Many of them are here today. Just give them a round of applause if you would. And then many of you were involved in the initial public meeting where we shared what the plan looked like as it was proposed. Many of you Some of you liked elements in theirs, others had ideas about how we could improve it. So after that initial public meeting, we invited you to the parking summits. And the parking summits were an opportunity to sit with neighbors and stakeholders and other small business owners and talk about how do we improve the plan as it currently exists. And you'll see as we walk through the presentation tonight, a lot of that feedback has gone into the plan as it currently exists. Not everybody will be happy. I've been doing this a long time. Nobody's ever completely happy at the beginning, but we know we're moving in a better direction, and we're really excited about the evaluation of this project over the next 6 months once implementation happens, and then that might lead us to additional changes, and that's okay. And so that brings us to tonight's information sharing with you, the presentation of the current plan. We'll be getting into that in just a moment. Last thing I'll talk about then is just kind of recapping for you that community engagement process we've engaged in. While a lot of you have engaged in a lot of ways, and we appreciate it, it's really helped to get a better product. You recall almost 1,100 of you were engaged in the survey process early on, and so we surveyed folks who lived in the area. Obviously, residents were a huge part of the survey base. You all constituted over half of the respondents, but then we also talked to employees through the survey as well, out-of-town visitors, because they do patronize and come to Short North and support local businesses, and we need that. We also talked to Metro visitors, people like me who don't live in the immediate area but come to Short North quite a bit. All of those perspectives were a part of our survey. The survey and the focus group process, you'll also see we had resident focus groups as a part of this early on. The employee group we had, as well as business owners, they really helped us to define what don't people understand, what are the pain points that currently exist, and how do we start to get from you some ideas around solutions before we really move into the broader community engagement process. So those things happened early on. Thank you for those who were involved in those processes. I saw a number of you walk in tonight, and I appreciate your feedback over the course of that process. From there, we also had a few interviews with individuals from the community and certain people who represent community groups. And again, it was about that early feedback process. So we thank those individuals as well for taking the time to participate in that process. You also see throughout the process, we've allowed you to submit your questions through an online form on the website, and about 200 of you have done that. And that has really been invaluable to us as well. You've done comments, you've asked questions. Those emails went to members of our team, but they also went right to Robert Farron at the Department of Public Service, and he was the one responding back to you as quick as he could around getting responses to your questions, clearing up misinformation, which has been a lot out there over the course of this project. And so we've been appreciative for you actually sending those questions in and then giving them back to us. We had about 126 of you at the initial public meeting. It was over at the convention center, so we thank you for your participation in that process, hearing where the plan actually stood at that point, and then of course it's changed quite a bit since that time we were together. Almost 100 of you and over 2 sessions came to participate in our parking summits. Those were held on a Saturday and a Tuesday morning to allow for some flexibility in schedule, and many of you participated in that process, and we appreciate you coming out. Give us workable solutions, and we try to work them into the plan, and so that's what you see as a part of the engagement process that you helped us to kind of shape this final version. And then there's been comment cards at the previous public meetings, at the summit. If there were questions that we could pose during that time, we answered as many as we could. We also had you to write those down, and all of those have been categorized and are on record and on the website for you to be able to review as you evaluate the plan and where it stands. We had a hotline just as an additional option. Only about 3 of you called. Maybe you don't like to talk on the phone, but that's okay. But about 3 of you participated in that process, and so we appreciate that information as well. So that kind of, really robust community engagement here. A lot of you have weighed in. A lot of you have shared your thoughts about the plan as it exists and as it has evolved. And I think you'll understand how some of that feedback has been taken throughout the course of tonight's presentation. And then finally, and I'll revisit this once Robert is done, I want to talk a little bit about the Q&A process. You do have the green cards. I talked about that already. We really want you to limit your questions to elements of the plan and things that are broader in nature. If you have a specific question about your particular address, it's fine if you write a question about it. It may not get posed directly if it's only about your individual property, but you will get a response to that. And so make sure that as a part of that green card that I gave you, that you actually put down an email address or a phone number that we can get that information back to you. What we'll be addressing is, something funny? I missed it. I'm not going to do that. Okay. Thank you. So at after the questions have been grouped together, our team will be passing questions. We'll be posing those to Robert, and he'll be answering those tonight in real time up until our time limit. And then at that point, anything that are additional will of course, be documented and then put onto the website for your consumption. And then, of course, again, we want to keep the questions specific to any of the plan elements. But anything's on the table. If you have questions, you don't understand the element, that's exactly what we want you to post to us so we can get as much clarity on the plan as possible. That is coming in right now. So. Let's get to the presentation. If it's not addressed in the presentation, then certainly feel free to ask your question and we can address any specifics at that point. With that said, I'm going to bring forward Robert Farron. Many of you have had a chance to engage with him with the Department of Public Service. Robert's going to walk you through the plan as it exists today, talk about the process of how we've gotten here and where we're going forward from here, and then at that point we'll open it up to questions toward the end of the process. If you have questions throughout the course of the evening, feel free to pass those toward the center aisles on either side. We'll be answering those throughout the course of the evening once the presentation is complete. Please welcome Robert Farron, who will give the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, everybody. First, I want to say thank you for your involvement and patience through this process. This has been a long process for many of you. It's been a longer process for many of you than it has for I. And I sincerely appreciate the passion and commitment this community has made in making this planning effort successful. I also want to thank Rama Consulting, Mo Wright and team for the work they've done with this planning effort. We've received such great feedback through this effort. And we've received a lot of great feedback about Mo and his team so that with all these meetings, people are able to have their voice heard, able to ask critical questions, and able for us to have a constructive conversation. We're going to be going over these plan elements this evening. We're going to be following a similar format to the community meeting 1 in terms of the organization. We do want to walk through where we've been, where we are, where we're headed. I want to start with our plan goals. I want to remind everybody, we've talked about these many times. I'll summarize all these by saying that we need to implement a plan that's easily understandable, is easy to use for all users, and that we can administrate and enforce at the city. And what I've heard loud and clear through this entire effort is you have to be able to enforce this. If you're going to put up a sign, if you're going to charge people for parking, you have to be able to enforce it. We've heard that loud and clear. We believe we've hit all the points of these plan goals that I'm going to go over this evening. However, we also understand that whatever we put in November is not perfect. There's not a right solution here. There's a starting place, and then from there we have a modification, assessment, evaluation process to get it as right as we can as time goes on. I also want to mention that we cannot forget that as a community we have to embrace other mobility options to get from point A to point B. It's our job at the city, it's our job through our partners, whether it's CODA, other on-demand transportation services, that we deliver those options and that the community utilize them. In my opinion, if we're always equating access with a single occupancy vehicle, we failed. And in my mind, that's a losing proposition on both the economic, social, and environmental platform. So I'm always harping on the leveraged mobility options. We have to start thinking a little more strategically and outside the box about how we get from point A to point B. I'll get off my soapbox now, and I will talk about the zones. Number 1. This was the first iteration. This was the original map with the inner and the outer zone. If you remember from the first effort, there were about 9 to 10 zones that were proposed. We streamlined those to 3. Certainly more streamlined than the 13 plus unique restrictions we have out there today that only cover about half this area. So keep that in mind. That was our first map. This is our revised map. So let me talk to you about the revised map and how we went from 3 to 5 zones. The feedback we heard from the planning summits as well as the community workshop was that parking demand is different north of 5th than south of 5th. And because of that, we broke that area into its own zone, permit zone SNE. We also heard that the inner zone was too large. Because of that, people felt like they didn't have as much protection with their permit if people could cross High Street east and west. So we bisected the inner zone into now permit zones SNA and SNB.
Operating at High Street, how
Folks,
I'll
it's
get-
really going to be important
to that in a
that
second.
we allow the presentation to go forward, and then we're happy to answer your questions, but it's not going to be productive just to blurt out questions. We're not going to be able to answer them.
Thank you. With permit zone SNA, which was the previous interzone, we heard a lot of feedback from those on Wilbur, Hubbard, Highland. They were feeling squeezed by Goodale Park and the fact we don't have streets to the park, obviously, and they felt like being included in the interzone would give them some more flexibility. So we did carve out the SNA zone, the previous interzone, to go to Neal to give those permit holders some more flexibility. We did receive some feedback about bisecting zone permit zone SNE at High Street to create a sixth zone. We as staff took that comment in, and we felt that based on the size of the zone, if we were going to bisect that, at least at the start, there wouldn't be as much permit flexibility, especially for those that live just west or east of High Street if they couldn't find a parking space, to limit those individuals to just having to park east or west of High. So we... Thank you. We also heard a lot of feedback from the border streets in the neighborhoods. People just west of Neal, not on Neal, but west of Neal. Those that are north and east of the Summit 4th and 5th area. Those are things that we're going to look at after we implement and after the 6-month stabilization period, where we'll be adjusting quite a few things in the plan, but namely zones. Those are areas where we'll be looking at existing zone boundaries as well as looking at expanding potentially. The thing to know about the zones as we get to restrictions, the zone allows a permit holder exemption from the time limit in that zone. So whatever restriction we have in, say, permit zone SNA, your permit will exempt you from all of those restrictions. Your permit would not exempt you from a restriction if you went into SNB, C, D, or E. So those permit notations are really for the permit holder to know where they can park an exemption of a time limit and where they can't. Let me talk about rates and restrictions. Rates and regulations. And most of this presentation, we're going to look at original feedback and then what the output was. The original plan for the interzone, which now is generally SNA, B, and C, was a 3-hour time limit, a paid time limit, from 8 a.m. to midnight. There was no contemplation of an overnight restriction. The overarching feedback we've heard from all the various sources is that residents in particular wanted a parking rate that was higher than the garages. So the original proposal was $2 an hour. Also, the lack of an overnight restriction would allow for unregulated parking in the evening hours. And most of the comments we heard was not about the parking aspect of that, but the non-parking aspect of that. Noise, litter, et cetera, things that may happen after a certain point in the evening. Based on that feedback, based on the rates not being high enough, and based on the lack of an overnight restriction to help with both parking as well as non-parking related issues, the revised plan for the interzone, now SNA, B, and E, is an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., 3-hour paid parking restriction. It would be $2 an hour from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m., and from 3 p.m. till 10 p.m., the higher demand time, it would be $3 an hour. That puts us at $1 to $1.50 over the average 3-hour stay in one of the parking garages in Short North. We've also included a permit-only restriction. That permit-only restriction starts at 10 p.m. and goes till 8 a.m. So the sign in this area would state no parking from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., 3-hour paid parking from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., permit exempt. Again, meaning that as a resident or employee permit holder, you'd be exempt from both the 3-hour and the payment as well as the no parking. We are introducing a new restriction in non-residential areas, and I'll get to that in a second. That would just be from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. It's a 3-hour free restriction. So we're posting a 3-hour sign, but we're not requiring payment. Those are in front of commercial properties, majority commercial blocks that would create turnover and access to those businesses that are embedded into the neighborhood, where a permit would not be allowed in those areas. It would be for patrons, and at 10 p.m. it would become unrestricted. So there is some flexibility with those spaces. I'll get to that in a minute where those are located. Most of the streets will have a permit restriction, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. paid, 3-hour max. We're not going to let anyone go beyond that 3-hour stay. 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., permit only. The outer zone, SNC and SND, the original plan had even less restrictive parking than 8 a.m. to midnight. We had contemplated a 3 p.m. to midnight 3-hour time limit with no charge. We overwhelmingly heard from residents and some businesses in the area that by having it less restrictive in the outer zone, we were literally pushing the problem east and west of those border streets. Stakeholders also felt that we needed to price that parking, that there shouldn't be that much free parking or free of anything in the area. So with that being said, based on that feedback, we're having the exact same restriction in the outer zones. 8 a.m. till 10 p.m., 3-hour paid parking, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. permit only. The only difference we have in the outer zone to recognize that those spaces are farther away from High Street is it'll be $1 an hour from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., $2 an hour from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. The commercial provision still applies. Predominantly commercial streets would simply have an 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. 3-hour restriction. Most of those areas are in the 5th, 4th Summit area. So let's talk about this a little bit. There's also a map board when you came in that had the original zone and as well as the new zone proposal or plan. This now is a more detailed map. This is a draft map. We are continuing to evaluate if we are classifying the land uses correctly. We're going to be walking every single block, driving every single block to make sure that these restrictions make sense. Generally, as you see, and I broke the district into two because of the orientation of the map. We have sort of the north area and then the south area on the far side. The green lines are where we would put the permit restriction. 8 to 10, 3-hour paid, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., permit only. The orange areas are the areas where we would be putting in just the 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. 3-hour time limit. We wouldn't be charging for that parking, at least initially, and that provides turnover. As you can see, most of this is green. The red's no parking. We just currently have no parking in those areas because of the size of the street. And then the purple is metered areas, and metered spaces will stay where they are today. We're not going to expand our metered parking. So the orange, and I apologize, this has not come up great on a PowerPoint presentation, but toward the back, again, we have that board. It is a draft. Some of our major thoroughfares are orange because not only do we have commercial, but if we have residential, we have peak period restrictions where there's no parking at all. So we did not want to give the sense to somebody that you could park with your permit an exemption of a no stopping zone for peak period restrictions. So a lot of those do line up with peak period restricted streets, and the other ones are very much geared toward more the northeastern side of the plan area where we have more commercial or just vacant property and we don't have residents living on those blocks. This is a draft. This is something we're going to finalize over the summer, and we'll have at our open house this summer that I'll talk about in a minute. Before I get to the rest of the revised plan elements, the permit eligibility, the permit allocation, I want to pause for a moment and discuss why we made the decisions we made on time limit restrictions, permit only restrictions, where we landed on the 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. Permit only, where we have the 3-hour paid parking. This was the most difficult element of the plan. We had our task force meeting. It was a 3-4+ hour meeting. We came to some resolution on quite a few of these elements. The one thing we could not come to resolution on was, one, do we introduce a permit only? And if we do, when does it start and when does it end? So we took all the feedback. There was no consensus on this item. We also collected data. So based on data and stakeholder feedback, for the data part, we looked at occupancy data and conducted updated parking counts in late April. On Thursday, April 19th, and Friday, April 20th. On April 19th, we took our evening counts. That's where you have resident demand as well as visitor demand. The counts were done between 7 and 9 p.m. They were done when the Blue Jackets had a home playoff game. So we felt like if there was ever going to be a lot of parking demand, especially closer to downtown in the Short North area, that was going to be the evening. And then on April 20th, on Friday morning, we had a team go out between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. and count cars, with the assumption that at that point, that's resident demand. Could it be some people who decided to stay over or, shouldn't have driven after the playoff game? Possibly. But the assumption is between 3 and 5 a.m. on any given morning, it should be resident parking demand. The data was compiled on the old zones I'll talk about in a minute, and I apologize for that because we had not adjusted the plan yet. We had our team aggregate the data based on our occupancy metrics. I've talked about this a little bit in previous meetings. 0 to 60%, 60 to 80%, 80 to 100%, and over 100%, meaning people are probably illegally parked. In the morning, we observed overall in the whole plan area, 60% average occupancy. So resident demand across the entire area, not being equal, I'll get to that in a minute, we observed on average 60% parking occupancy across all streets in the planning area. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. As we know, parking occupancy is not equal among streets. We have small streets, we have large streets, we have different intensity uses on streets. In that morning count, 67%, or 2/3 of the plan area, had what we would call healthy occupancy, between 0 and 80%. Was anyone at 0? No, but that's just the range. Between 0 and 80%. So 2/3 of our streets in the morning, in this area, resident demand, had a healthy parking occupancy, meaning you could still find a space. That also means that 1/3 is unhealthy. It's 80 to 100+%. And that's why we're here tonight, because we have areas that are experiencing more pain than others. Some areas don't have a parking problem at all. In the evening, we conducted those counts, and we knew the parking occupancy would increase overall. I was shocked to see it only went up 10% on average across the entire plan area, from 60 to 70%. What I was not shocked about is now 46% of blocks, almost half the blocks, had unhealthy occupancy. They were experiencing more pain than we want, which is the 80 to 100% plus. And sorry, this seems like a math exercise. I apologize for that. This is just the graphic representation of what I just talked about, where we have the total occupancy by zone at the top and then at the bottom by range. So before we get to the map that actually shows visually where we have unhealthy and healthy parking occupancy, I want everyone to keep in mind the following aspects of our existing conditions. First, we knew parking demand would be variable across the area, especially when we knew we were doing playoff night. We would expect higher occupancy closer to 670. Second, parking occupancy may be unhealthy on one block, but 1 to 2 blocks away, it's underutilized. It's in the 0 to 60%, it's in the green area. Third, it's my belief that our existing fragmented block situation of 13 plus restrictions creates inequities block by block. You may assume that all unhealthy blocks do not have a time restriction, or that all healthy blocks have a permit only or time restriction. Not true on either account. What we have found is proximity to a traffic generator, which makes sense, and the sheer makeup of a street. I have 6 homes and 5 parking spaces. It's probably always going to be full. One side parking only, the other side no stopping because we have some narrow streets in this area. Affect parking occupancy more than this fragmented management strategy we have. Also, please keep in mind, none of our side streets have pricing. We have multiple levers at our disposal to manage parking. We have time limits, we have permits, we have pricing. We haven't even introduced the third variable yet, and yet we still have overall somewhat healthy occupancy. So with that, I'll show the map, which again is, I'm sorry, going to be not amazing with this scale. So for that, I apologize. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go block by block here. What I want to indicate here, this is the morning. This is the evening on the side. Green and yellow are what we consider healthy occupancies, 0 to 80% occupied. Orange and red, unhealthy. Parking demand's clearly variable block by block. We have red and orange next to yellow and green. Some areas have higher occupancy in the morning, have higher occupancy with resident demand than evening demand, which we'd have to look more into. Overall, there's capacity on these streets, even on a block-by-block measurement. The majority of blocks have capacity and are in the healthy occupancy range. So this data, coupled with your feedback, help inform our decision-making process to finalize that restriction at 8 a.m., 10 p.m., 3-hour paid restriction, which we don't even use that concept right now, and then switch to a 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. permit-only restriction. If this map had bled red across all zones, we would have had a much different decision-making process on our hands than showing that, yes, there are areas that are experiencing unhealthy occupancy, and that's what we're here for, But we also, on average, in the majority of blocks, do not have a significant parking challenge. On some days, I'm sure absolutely. But on average, at least this moment in time, and that's a benefit and failure of this, it's a moment in time, we felt comfortable pushing for that 10 p.m. start time for the permit only, knowing there does need to be prioritization for parking and non-parking related challenges that do occur late in the evening. The benefit district, there's no change to this, but we have not done an amazing job at explaining what the benefit district is, what it does, and how it affects you in a positive way. So let me take a second to explain that. First, we got a lot of questions about, well, how much money is this? We finally sharpened the pencil, and based on a lot of decisions we had to make through this planning effort, we now know how much that is. We're estimating approximately $200,000 per year will be provided back to this district for the purposes of parking and mobility projects. It breaks down this way. We estimate approximately $2 million in parking meter revenue will be produced with the increase in meter rates. We anticipate about just over $500,000 in mobile payment revenue will be generated. Those are from non-metered streets. Those are from permit streets. So the bulk of the revenue is coming from the metered streets and not the mobile payment streets. On the expense side, this all costs money. $1 million for personnel costs. That includes adding a third shift enforcement team that I'll talk about in a minute. About $850,000 in operational expenses, non-enforcement personnel, vendor services, internal departmental costs. And we're going to have a $450,000 a year set aside for capital reserve, so that when meters need to be replaced, when license plate recognition cameras need to be replaced, when vehicles need to be replaced, when signs need to be replaced, we have money there, and we're not trying to, pay as you go. So what would the money be used for? The mobility and parking projects include a late night employee shuttle system, a validation program to encourage visitors to use garages, especially the underutilized portions of them in the daytime, and marketing and outreach of mobility options for employees and visitors, and residents as well. The goals of these projects is to reduce the use of neighborhood streets for non-resident and local needs by providing alternatives to increase access to the Short North. We're always looking at providing additional options. One, I think there's an environmental, social, and economic benefit to that, but there's also a very true benefit to, if we can get more people to use the garages, we get more people to use other modes of transportation, it's just less people parking. And that's going to be good for residents who will see indirect benefit from that at minimum. And at maximum, we're going to see more employees be able to get to work on time, not be searching for parking in the neighborhood, and making sure that this area continues to thrive certainly the way it has. Parking enforcement. This is a key aspect of the program. We heard loud and clear the original plan did not have an overnight enforcement team because we weren't contemplating overnight parking restrictions. Now that we've added a permit only, we are going to be adding a third shift. That's new for us. Right now we roll off the street about 10:30. People know that. Even though our restrictions go into the evening, people understand that you're not going to get a ticket after a certain point in time. We would be introducing a third shift enforcement team. We would have active parking enforcement in the Short North between 7:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., Monday through Saturday, utilizing license plate recognition where we can be much more efficient than we are today. We're going to be able to create beats where we can go every 3 to 3.5 hours. We're not going to issue a ticket at 3 hours and 1 minute. No one wants that. We are going to be issuing tickets based on if you've spent too much time in the space, whether you have a permit or not, or whether you've paid or not, every 3 to 3.5 hours on all these streets. And we look forward to everyone providing feedback on that and keeping us honest on that part of the plan. Let's talk about parking permits. We'll start with employees. There's been a big shift in all the permit programs as originally recommended. The original proposal for employees was 2 permits per business, one in the inner zone, one in the outer zone. We heard a lot of feedback from businesses that I have more than 2 employees. We heard a lot of feedback from residents saying, how is this going to affect small business, especially daytime business? We went back to the drawing board on this. And again, we revised recommendations based on data. What we know about Short North businesses generally is that most have 10 employees or less. Most of them are staying open till 6 or 7 and probably need parking till at least 8 p.m. So armed with that information, kind of what the small business need is, coupled with the feedback we heard, we have increased the permit allocation. It's a sliding scale. It's up to 10 permits per business. Businesses must supply to the city their business filing with the Ohio Secretary of State and either be the primary leaseholder or demonstrate ownership of the property to receive permits. So co-working has been a big question. Co-working, only the primary leaseholder would receive 10 permits. The first 4 permits are $100 annually. They're valid for the zone in which the business is located. Permits 5 through 10, we have a sliding scale. $200 for the 5th permit, $300, $400, $500, up to $700 for the 10th permit. Those are annual charges. They're only valid in the nearest outer zone to the business, and they're only valid from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. They are not 24/7 carte blanche permits like the first 4. It's a recognition based on pricing and limits that there should be other benefits that we provide to our employees in this area, but for the parking space. Employers will manage their permit account. They can add, modify, or delete license plates as they see fit. We're only going to verify that a business owner can set up an account. After that, it's up to them. Multiple plates can be on a permit, so long as multiple plates are not found to be parking at the same time under that permit. So for example, you have offsetting shifts. You could have, as a business owner, multiple plates on one permit, only spend the $100. Just don't let us catch both of those plates as we go around with LPR. One of those vehicles will get a ticket. So here are your options as an employee-employer. You can use the employee permits that are provided under the program I just talked about. You can park in a Short North garage. There is monthly parking available, although it is fairly pricey, $150 to $250 a month, depending on the garage and what the limitations are of those parking spaces. Can park downtown and utilize the late night shuttle that we're working on with our funding partners, or utilize existing transit services. C-Bus just extended. We're working on with CODA to extend other services later in the evening. And then also the city's finalizing plans to fund an employee mobility fund with our Short North partners to facilitate discounts on transit, ride share, car share, and other mobility options. We'll be working with our partners over the summer to make sure we have those programs up and running. We can market and communicate those programs so that when we start this program in November, everyone has an option. Resident permits. So, the original proposal was a 2-tiered fee structure. It was $25 for a permit without guest privileges, $100 with guest privileges. We heard a couple pieces of feedback on the resident permit. One, it was too expensive. It needed to include a low-income provision based on a set of required application documents. We also heard there needed to be more flexibility across the entire permit program, whether it be the number of permits we issue or the fees. So this is the updated permit program for the Short North area. It includes a $25 flat fee for permits. You can also purchase a $25 annual guest parking privilege. More about that in a minute. The $25 annual guest parking privilege can be purchased by any eligible address, not just those that have cars. We got a lot of feedback from those that don't own a car in the Short North, and they felt like they were being not only priced out, but made ineligible to get guest parking if they wanted someone to come over. So we've included this system where, as an account holder, if you're eligible to purchase a permit, you can purchase a permit for your vehicle at $25, or you can purchase a $25 guest parking privilege, and that will gain you access to different passes I'll talk about in a minute. We're also going to include a low-income provision that will pertain to resident permits only, not guest permits, and they'll be $10 annually. Our staff is currently working on what those required documents would be. Several of you have emailed us about the Seattle RPZ program. We've actually talked to SDOT this week, and we're working out how can we mimic that program, because that is a great program they have in Seattle. Let's talk about eligibility. So this has changed a little bit. We now have a 4 units or less or 5 units or more. The allocation is the same across all units now. We had a difference of allocation before. Now it's the same rules, except if the property was built after 2009, they're not eligible for parking permits if you're 5 units or more. I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, what does 5 units or more mean and 4 units or less? I'm going to give you an example. On Denison, between 2nd and Star, on the west side of the street, we have some new builds. We have some row homes, townhomes on the south side of Denison at 2nd, and we have the Jerome on the north side at Star. Great example of the south units, the row homes that are individually addressed, we would treat as 1 unit each. They would fall in the 4 units or less. The Jerome, a different type of property, different addressing, different parcel makeup, they're in the 5 units or more. That building would not be eligible for permits. There's other examples like that, and we'll continue to field those questions. This summer at our workshop, at our open house, we'll have a map that shows every single property, whether you're eligible or not eligible. Our staff is currently working on that. Eligible properties are entitled to up to 2 resident permits per address. We're also going to introduce a requirement that you must match a driver's license to the vehicle registration and cannot have more permits than people applying for a permit. So if you're 2 people and you have 4 cars, wonderful. You can get 2 permits. The other 2 vehicles, there are some options for you I'll get to in a second. Although maybe not the greatest option you're going to like, but that's okay. We're trying to find some compromise here. The driver's license address will also have to match the applicant's address. That's a new feature for our RPP program. I will say it's fairly typical of most RPP programs in this country to match driver's license with address. It helps reduce fraud. It helps reduce a situation where there's 10 people in a house and some people have a lease, some people don't. We want to match the address to the place where you're applying for a permit. We will issue you a 90-day temporary if you cannot come into compliance with that regulation, and then you have 90 days to update your driver's license so we can document that there's no fraudulent use of those permits and that you are indeed a resident at that address. Addresses are maxed out at 2 permits. As with everything in government, there's an appeal process. If you require more than 2, we'll have an appeal form, and we'll take those on a case-by-case basis. Resident guest parking. The original was that 2-tiered structure at $100, 2 passes per day. We did away with that. Residents said, I want some more flexibility. $100 is too much. I want you to uncouple these things. I want to have a resident permit. I want to have this guest parking privilege. The guest parking privilege is $25 annually. What does that get you? It gets you, and it's by account. It's not by permit. So each address would get a guest parking privilege, not each permit holder. $25 annually. It would entitle the account holder to 1 guest pass with no limitations. So for the 3rd vehicle people in the room, you could put that 3rd plate on there. There's no limitation. You could use that for 3 hours for a guest coming over. You could use it for 365 days. You manage that in your account. It's by plate. You enter into your system. There's no verification of that plate. That's yours to manage as you see fit. You're also entitled to purchase up to 300 24-hour passes at $6 each. I'll talk about the limit. I'll talk about the price. We originally had a 300 permit provision in there. Most people were okay with the limit per year. They didn't want a daily permit. They didn't want us telling you how many people you can have over for evening dinner one time. There's no limit on a daily basis. If you want to use all 300, go for it. I don't think you'll find parking. You can use all 300. The $6 rate is to prevent fraud, namely, we're allowing for 3-hour parking for flexibility for a lot of things in the neighborhood up until 10 p.m. The $6 fee is purposeful. If you have someone coming over for an hour or 2, it might make sense just for them to pay the mobile app. Just pay for a couple dollars worth of parking and save these $6 guest passes for something else. But if you want someone to park longer than 3 hours or into the permit-only restriction where no one else can park but permit holders, you would utilize a $6 guest pass. You can set that up on your account. You can go online and set that up, or you can ask your visitor, hey, I'm going to give you a validation code. You go pay for this, and that will exempt you from the time limit as well as paying, and that's a 24-hour from the time you purchase it. It's a 24-hour guest pass. The one no-limit guest pass I said would be managed by the resident account holder via an online portal. And the 324-hour guest passes will be app or on the account. Our vendor selection process is almost done with the city. We hope to get the contract approved by council in June. And then we will start working with them on actually how this works. And at the workshop open house this summer, we would be able to have people test out the beta version of the app and the website. Finally, Short North visitors in the last 5 minutes here. So parking meters, this is the one thing we really haven't changed much. The meters are still going to be 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. It's a 3-hour restriction. We are not stopping someone from feeding the meter. You can feed the meter to your heart's content. In fact, you will be able to use an app. So you don't have to go back out to the meter. You can just pay it from your phone if dinner is running late. It'll be $1 for the first hour. It'll be $1 an hour from 8 a.m. till 3 p.m. From 3 p.m. till 10 p.m., it'll be $2 an hour. And after that, it's unrestricted. You'll be able to pay via credit card and coin and also the app. Visitors also have the option to park in the mobile pay-only zones. However, It's not great parking. You're limited to up to 3 hours. We will not let you re-up your parking. You'll have to move out of that zone. It's $2 an hour in the morning and $3 an hour in the evening. So it costs more than parking closer to where you probably want where your destination is. Visitors, among everyone else, can also use the C-Bus, transit options, other things to get to and from Short North. By putting all these restrictions in, we have eliminated two main things: unmanaged, unregulated employee parking in the neighborhood, although we are providing a permit option for that, and we have eliminated and are not providing a solution for C-Bus riders. Short North has become kind of a de facto park and ride for C-Bus riders, especially Mount Pleasant 3rd area. That's going to go away. That will now not be an option. Will not let you extend your time. You'd have to take the bus back every 3 hours and move your car out of a different zone. I don't think that'll happen. So we can't solve most things. We can solve that one. Plan assessment and evaluation, and then I'll hand it back over to Mo and team. Our goal is to implement this program November 13th. That's purposeful. It's a Tuesday after Veterans Day. It gives us the opportunity to rip covers off of 2,000 plus new signs that are going to go in this area. This is dependent on a couple key factors. We're not going to launch it November 13th because that's the date. We want to make sure we get it right. We're going to see how well sign installation goes. There could be unforeseen circumstances in driving all those new posts in the ground. We're going to see how quickly our vendor comes on board via contracting, which as a city official, I know sometimes that takes a while. And we want to make sure our LPR is tested well, our permit management system's tested well, our mobile pay app is tested well. If those things do not fall in line by October, when we open up our application process, we will push this off till January, and we will implement in January. If you're an existing permit holder in this room, and you're on a January renewal, not the August renewals, January, we would require you to set up a new account in October, but your permit will be good from October through January of 2020. So you're going to pay ahead a little bit, but not pay for more than what you're entitled to. As a new permit holder, we're going to want you to get your account set up by October. So for all existing permit holders, you need to be on the new system. You'll pay ahead a few months, but then you'll still get the same value in terms of it won't be expiring until January of 2020. Our first evaluation period is in May of 19. That's a 6-month stabilization period. We'll be adjusting rates, permits, time limits, and also zones, and zones should be on there. I apologize for that. The changes will be implemented to meet our goal of achieving 60 to 80% occupancy. I get a lot of questions on what that means. So 60 to 80% occupancy, what we've heard is these zones are pretty big. I just talked about across the entire plan area, we're 60 to 80%. So we would walk away and not do anything, right? Wrong. We know that parking occupancy is very local. So what we're going to be doing is we have our 5 zones, and overlay with that we have subzones. We will be adjusting rates at the onset on the subzones. So a great example is this little area in Italian Village. We know that that area and this area probably has some of the highest parking demand in the city. We would not take the parking occupancy of this entire zone and define success. We are going to take occupancy of these smaller areas, and we will first adjust rates. If we have successive rate changes and we cannot affect behavior, we cannot get to 60 to 80% occupancy, we will change the sign. I've gotten a lot of feedback on once you put the sign up, you're going to walk away. I'm not going to let the cost of aluminum get in the way of getting this plan right. We'll use stickers first, because my traffic team will be awfully annoyed at me if we're going to replace 2,000 signs. We'll use stickers first. But I am guaranteeing that we are going to get to 60 to 80% occupancy on these blocks via permit restrictions, time limits, and rates. We want to start with rates. We feel like that's a very powerful tool that we have not used in the city of Columbus, whether it's at meters or in permit areas. We want to use rates, but we will be compelled to change other things, not just rates, based on subzone. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Mo. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So we're going to start Q&A now. I do have a mic here. So Robert's going to be answering questions for us. Many of you get them, and the folks are still collecting cards. So Chris is on the aisle. He'll be able to take them. This first question comes from a resident who wants to know, having residents pay for permits is outrageous. Also, this setup effectively the actual current setup would effectively not allow for residents to have parties or gatherings of multiple people. Talk more about that provision.
Sure, so I'll talk about the fee. We're not just in the Short North, a small team, but we're also working around Children's Hospital. We got the same question from Southern Orchards and Schumacher Place a couple weeks ago. Why am I paying for permits? Something else created this issue. We have a policy in the city of Columbus that we want to at least try to cover our costs to the administration of this program. And
Sir.
So based on that, right now we currently charge $25 for permits across the city. We would continue that fee to help recover some costs. That being said, when you think about $25 a year, you break that down to monthly or daily cost. We are not trying to make any money off this. In fact, when you look at the benefit district, you can see it's coming from the meter revenue. That's where we want our revenue to come from. It is $25 a piece. We are going to introduce a low-income provision. It is to help defray costs so that the whole city, all 850,000 people in Columbus who don't typically have restricted parking for various reasons, are not paying for that program. It is a program that can be standalone as much as possible through areas that are getting an enhanced parking management service that no one else gets. Permits, signs, as well as enforcement. Most of our city does not have parking enforcement. To the question about limiting parties, we've limited it at 300 a year. We actually thought about just making it unlimited. And we actually heard some feedback from our task force as well as some community members. There's always an appeal process. So if you get to 300 and we want to talk about additional permits, I think we can have that conversation. We're looking at how can we create a plan that, one, is not detrimental to any one user group, i.e. people moving away or killing business. We do not want to be detrimental to any part of any use. But how do we focus on the majority of needs? And when we looked at the survey data, for people who currently have permits, people didn't even know we had a 24-hour guest permit, because right now you have to go down the impound to get it. Most people barely even use their hang tag that we're going to make virtual. So we felt like limiting to 300, the vast majority of people would be very comfortable under that limitation, knowing that there is an appeal process.
And along with, excuse me.
We have allowed you to build all those damn buildings on High Street.
I paid over $300,000 in taxes here the last 20 years. They've done nothing in the alleys or the streets or the curbs.
I want to focus
we do
on
understand.
You won't see any curbs.
We do understand. If you have a question about the development piece, if you have a question about the current practices of the city, we're happy to answer them. I just need you to follow the process, right? These other folks have actually given questions, so we're going to ask these right now. Why are residents asked to pay anything? Ditto for guests of residents. Why is there a fee at all for parking permits?
So again, the fee for the resident permit is to help cover those administrative costs of the program. Again, that's a benefit that other people in the city are not getting. Now granted, other areas of the city don't have the parking pressures this area has. Understandable. The guest parking privilege, we are trying to walk that balance. We are going to be restricting streets via pay and permit only and creating a parking market. And there's a lot of individuals who are going to want to park in this area and not want to pay or not want to just stay for 3 hours and don't live or work in the area. So we're trying to put a value. So, sir.
It's going to happen. This man's trying to help and you're yelling at him. He's not even from this city.
So the $6 parking charge is a recognition that, yes, there's a value to that. It's giving you much more. It's giving you exemption of the 3 hour as well as 24 hours. And then we've given the ability from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. for people to just pay for that parking, whether it's your guest or just a visitor. So that's where the charge comes in. That's something we are willing to look at as time goes on. What I want to stress to the group is I'm committed to a stabilization period of 6 months. We're going to be evaluating data. What I don't want to have happen is we issue unlimited permits of any kind, and then we can't pull the reins back on any of that. What I suspect will happen in some of these areas, residents will be fighting residents for parking and guests will be fighting guests in some localized areas. We want to put some restrictions on it so we can prioritize resident permit parking. That's why we have restrictions. That's why we have permit fees. These are all for discussion as we evaluate and modify it. My guarantee and my obligation to you, because I'm obligating myself through a rule and regulation that my director will sign, is we are committed to evaluation after 6 months, and a quarter thereafter. Every 3 months, we're going to be evaluating this based on data, based on LPR data.
This question is around resident guest passes. How often can license plates be changed for long-term resident guests?
So for long-term resident guests, if you want to use that for your third car, if you want to, you can change it as much as you want. You would have an account with the city. You'd be able to go online. You'd also be able to call in if you so choose, and you'll be able to give us that license plate information, and you'll be able to select, I want to keep that vehicle on until I don't want it on my account. I only want it on for so many hours. We'll give you that flexibility. It's an opportunity for home health, maid service, dog walker, you name it, to have that flexibility for that third permit or for the resident. The guest passes, the 24-hour guest passes, they are 24 hours. So I would ask residents to think about, do you want to use that, or do you want to use the 3-hour provision during the day for your guests to park?
This resident says the city has put a priority on visitors while the residents may not be able to find parking in their zone after work. Why not permit only at 6 p.m.? That's
a great question. We heard a lot of, I'm going to be very transparent here. We have a lot of people that want permit only starting at 4 p.m., 5 p.m., 6 p.m. A compromise is 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. I'm a firm believer that there are more solutions to this problem than just a permit-only restriction. I appreciate that a permit-only sign gives comfort to some, but we have not actively enforced time limits, and we have not introduced the concept of charging to affect behavior, while at the same time, a permit-only restriction is great for some, but then you're put in a box. So we are not going to issue unlimited guest permits because that, I think, would create a whole other challenge for us, and we have that happen now in some respects, especially as we get closer to campus. We wanted to make sure there was some flexibility that you don't have to use your guest permit if you don't need to. And I will say, when you look at the zones, when you look at the data, we have capacity. Not everywhere, but we have some capacity. Again, if it was bleeding red, we'd have a much different answer for this group on the plan than starting at 10 p.m. Give us the opportunity to prove you rates, restrictions, and active parking enforcement will get you about as close to a permit only as you want through that prioritization, while also offering flexibility to residents.
This resident wants to know, how many signs will there be to explain the smartphone payment options, since that's new for us?
Yes, so we're going to have 2,000 new signs in this area because every street's going to have some kind of restriction. We're also going to put up no stopping zones at every corner, which most of these areas have. We'll have one sign that says no parking, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., 3-hour paid parking, permit exempt. We'll have a towaway zone placard on it, the little tow truck on it. Underneath that, one sign that has the Park Columbus app logo, some language on there, and a phone number. You will be able to use the app, or you'll be able to call in. We got a lot of feedback about text. All the vendors that proposed, we had 6 vendors propose on this contract. We're working with one right now. They all said text is actually a really bad option because it's not secure. So if you're doing credit card information via text on Wi-Fi, it's very susceptible to someone stealing that information. You'll be able to use the app. You'll be able to call in. This summer, we're going to be ramping up our efforts to introduce the public at large, not just permit holders, that we're going to have a new app. The app would be used at meters in Short North, and starting in sometime in 2019, we would then let the app be used for meters all over the city. We'll have a lot of signs up at each restriction sign. We'll also have a significant education outreach campaign.
So I want you to address this, may need to correct it. The question is, explain how you will enforce the 72-hour limit for parking on the street if you're not keeping LPR data overnight.
A lot of questions about that. So we always run this balance of fine balance of privacy. And a lot of people are kind of suspect of LPR. So how long are you keeping my data? How long? We have committed that at the end of the evening, when we roll off shift at 3 a.m. and before we pick up at 7:30, we are purging that data unless it's associated with a ticket. We already take pictures of your vehicles when we issue tickets. We are going to enforce 72-hour reactively. So it's going to be based on complaint, as it always is. The 72-hour rule is not very commonly known in Columbus. People have asked us, so I go on vacation for 5 days, you could tow my car. Yes, if your neighbor complains about it and we get out there in time and you haven't gotten back, that's not the point of the 72-hour. The point of the 72-hour rule is to get abandoned vehicles off the street. We'd be very reactive to that. We could leverage LPR for that, although we'd more than likely use our handheld devices and gather the information that way. Our rule is going to be after 24 hours, after the end of the shift, we're purging that data.
This question is around, suppose, why can't people who live on border streets like Fifth Avenue and Denison park on both sides of the street? Doesn't that inconvenience residents who live on these streets?
So we went back and forth on this. The original plan, one street was going to be the same permit zone. Then we went back. We have landed on the street is bisected. If you're on a zone border, you can park on one side of the street but not the other. Either way you slice it, there was going to be an inconvenience, and we're not in a position to allow border homes to have permit exemption from both areas. I think that could create an imbalance in the system. Yes, there is some inconvenience there. At the same time, your neighboring streets will have the same permit restriction. And we are adding parking, I will say, on Denison. We're going to be adding parking on the east side of Denison between Star, south through the park. That's to, one, gain some access to parking spaces, slow down traffic, but also give permit holders the ability to park on that street. We have run that by our traffic division. From a safety we would obviously not do anything that's unsafe. From a safety perspective and a traffic volume perspective, we feel comfortable adding parking on the east side of Denison. It has historically not been there because of the hospital. The hospital has fundamentally changed its operation over a number of years. And we feel like there's a value add to adding parking for those permit holders as well as slowing down traffic. Because I'll say, as someone who drives Denison, you can drive faster because you're not worried about bumping cars. We don't want people to hit cars, but at the same time, that does tend to slow traffic, which will help with cycling as well as pedestrian access.
So as you know, we've gotten quite a bit of feedback on the whole idea of construction workers in the neighborhood taking up parking. This resident wants to know, how does the plan impact worker vehicles like repairmen, cable guys, and other commercial services?
And actually, we just had a meeting about this with internal partners this afternoon. So one, construction workers in the neighborhood, that's something else we're going to solve for. Construction workers they could pay for up to 3 hours and they're going to have to move a zone. So we're going to have to be proactive with our development community and saying, you need to have some parking arrangements. You need to shuttle people in from the state fairgrounds or wherever. Number one, there's still an exemption. So there's some code changes I'll talk about at the very end here as a wrap up. Our current code states, and it would remain as proposed, that a commercial vehicle that is servicing the property is exempt from permit restrictions. So it's hard for us to enforce, right? You have to see a commercial plate or something identifiable on the vehicle that makes it seem like a commercial vehicle. We will not write that vehicle a ticket. If we see the same commercial vehicle over and over again from a construction company, we're going to issue tickets and we're going to let them dispute and then ask for forgiveness later. So delivery, that's still, you would not have to use your guest pass if you have a plumber come over, but we will be able to actively enforce that enough. We're going to solve for construction parking too. C-Bus and construction parking will be solved through this.
Around the issue of the neighborhood schools, as you know, they have concerts, kids are doing things, parents coming to see those children. How will they be impacted by these new restrictions?
We're working closely with both Hubbard as well as, all the schools. We've reached out from the beginning of this process in January, reached out to a number of the schools. We're going to be working with them on a case-by-case basis on permits for teachers. We feel like that's a different population. We should be making sure that teachers have permits if they're not, granted, we want them to park in a parking lot. Hubbard in particular is kind of constrained more than others. We're working with them on how do we provide some flexibility for PTA meetings, parent-teacher conference meetings, things like that. So churches and schools, we will be doing a case-by-case basis. That's in the plan summary document where we will be looking at different limits, different fee structures for those institutional uses. While at the same time, not issuing unlimited permits, because there's a recognition that there has to be balance across all uses.
So it's Buckeye Saturday. Folks are coming to the game. How will OSU football attendees, particularly on King Avenue, be treated?
So on King Avenue, we're either going to have a 3-hour, as I recall from the map, a 3-hour time limit with no payment in front of commercial, or a 3-hour paid parking limit with permit. And we'll be enforcing it. We're going to have active enforcement from 7:30 on the street, 7:30 a.m. till 3 a.m. They can chance it and park with the app for 3 hours. If that becomes an issue, and that's something that we'll take counts, every time we drive by, we're taking a parking count. Every time we enforce, we're collecting data. None of these moment in times anymore. We're going to have great, rich data to make decisions. If that becomes an issue, then we would move to put some kind of exemption. I'm not a big fan of putting exemptions like gallery hop. I know Italian Village has an exemption. We're not putting up all those exemptions anymore. It's a flat rate, it's a flat restriction, and we're gonna have to work the 80%, 90%, we're gonna try to make happy those one-off things, in this case, 8 to 10 a year, I think, something like that. We're gonna go on a case-by-case basis.
So believe it or not, has a smartphone. How do you navigate this new plan based on mobile payment without a smartphone?
Sure. So as we talked to other cities that have implemented this program, that's why we have to have a phone option. So as a permit holder, you can still go down to the impound and apply for your permits. You can mail it in. You can give us a call when you're trying to add guest permits. If you want someone to use the mobile app, someone with the mobile app can also call our vendor and get time on their parking stay. So phone or online. We suspect 95% of our transactions will occur online, because wouldn't it be nice just to do this from your home and not have to mail anything in and just get more or less instant gratification out of this? But we will have phone options as well as mail-in options for those that don't have the technology. So thank you. So for the 3-hour parking, so the mobile pay app will have an app logo, say Park Columbus, and it will have a phone number on it. You'll be able to call the phone number. Now you're gonna have to give them a credit card, because that's the option.
I think.
So the option, so you would be able to call a number. So you'd be able to use a flip phone. If you don't have a phone at all, yes, at that point you're limited to the parking meters, which we have 598 meters in the short north from 670 north. Those will still be able to accept coin as well as in credit card.
This question gets at implementation and education. So for folks who live in suburbs, who only come down to short north maybe 4 times a year, what will their signage look like? What will the sign say so they understand the new parking rules?
So we talked about the sign. I don't know if we need to talk about that again. This summer we'll have the mock-up of the sign. You'll be able to see the sign. We'll also post an image on the website when we have it finalized. That's where the benefit district dollars in particular, as well as our special parking area district dollars come in play, where we'll be partnering with our Short North partners to get the word out. We need a substantial marketing campaign that goes beyond the city press release to get the word out to both locals, metro visitors, and people coming down from Dublin or Worthington or wherever to say, this is where you park. You park in the garage, you park at the meter. The app will show real-time parking information, so people will be able to make decisions based on where parking is available as well as the rate. So we'll have a lot of different options. We have to do a better job of explaining this to the public at large. There's only so much you can do in a one-page infographic. We're going to lean on our partners and fund it through these different restricted funding mechanisms to get some marketing out. So you see an ad in the Dispatch, you see an ad in 614 magazine, those kind of things.
This question is specific about the map, particularly zone SNE. Why does zone SNE stop south mid-block of 9th Avenue?
So on 9th Avenue, we have OSU, I believe it's Campus Partners housing. Regardless, that housing would not be eligible for permits on 9th. So because of that, we didn't want to put a permit restriction in that no one on that street could use. So that's why we stopped it at 8th. We've gotten quite a few questions about Wyland Park. Why is all of Wyland Park not included? I'm not a big proponent of adding a whole neighborhood in because that's the neighborhood boundary. We looked at the parking demand and we felt like that was a logical stopping place right now. That being said, after the 6-month stabilization period, I suspect we'll be massaging those boundary borders to either expand or contract some areas based on feedback, based on data. We made those decisions based on major thoroughfares. In the case of 9th Avenue, those are new buildings that would not be those are multifamily.
On the question of timing, why not start the process prior to November election day?
That's a great question. I didn't even know when election day was, and I can honestly say that. So we actually said November 1st. That was our original date. And then we looked at the calendar and realized we were just after a gallery hop and OSU home game. We said that it's probably not a good time to be changing restrictions. November 13th is our go live. Purposefully, one, we have a lot of work to do. And we hope all these things fall in line that we can launch November 13th. It gives us the 3-day weekend to tear off 2,000 covers off of all these signs. If we are not ready, we'll launch in January. I'm not looking at an election date. I'm looking at when can we implement something that we can ease people into this, that we don't create any harm by implementing the program. It'll be November 13th, or it'll be sometime in January. We will have an update when we have our open house this summer. We'll have a firm date for that.
This question is about non-resident owners. Can you please clarify the non-resident owner, and i.e. Airbnb, property owners like that?
Thank you. And that wasn't in the presentation, but it's on the plan detail sheet. As a property owner, if you don't live in the neighborhood, all you have to do is document that you own it. You would be entitled to one $25 permit for your vehicle. And that would be it. So you'd be able to access your property as a permit holder. You wouldn't be entitled to any kind of guest passes. You'd only be entitled to one permit. Airbnb will be treated like a residential property unless they can meet the employee parking business permit eligibility. So if they have a state filing with the Secretary of State, then they would be entitled to choose residential or employee. They'd have to be individually addressed. And I don't know enough about that industry to know, are they all individually addressed or not? They'd have to be individually addressed, and an account could be set up for that address itself.
All right, I've been trying to stump you. This one might get it. All right. So in regards to the parking code changes, section 2105.21, please walk us through what the code says today and why any changes to the resident permit parking section around statutory construction is necessary. Section 2105.21. Are you prepared?
Thank you. I've almost memorized it, but I'm not going to go verbatim on the line item changes. So the code change, let me just talk briefly about that, because I also know we're getting late. I've lost some people. I want to talk about the next steps. Then we'll get back to Q&A. I'm happy to stay here until they take the hook. Our third task force meeting will be in July. We're going to bring our task force back together on implementation items. August, September, education campaign, as well as the open house. October, final notices go out to every property owner, every resident, every business. This is the plan. This is how you get your permit. And that's when the application process would open if we're ready to go live November 13th, and that's when the program would start. There are associated code changes. May 14th is first reading. May 16th from 4 to 6 p.m. in council chambers. It's a Wednesday. Our staff is proposing a series of code changes to modernize our parking system. Our code has not been changed in 20 plus years. We are requesting additional tools in the toolbox to manage parking. The only piece of the code change that affects the Short North parking plan is the benefit district. If the council was to decide we don't want to change any of these, we would go forward with 95% of this plan. I think that one of the more important pieces we would not go forward with is sharing back the money. We need council to legislate. We can establish benefit districts by ordinance, and then we come back this summer with an ordinance just for the Short North. We think that's critical. Permit parking. We are looking for flexibility in offering different permit types to different user groups. That being said, if that was to not go, we would still be able to implement this plan, because we have a set of rules and regulations that govern how we administrate the residential parking permit program. It's been a long-standing portion of that program that we do involve employee parking in high-demand areas. There's criteria for that. The residents are still prioritized in that rule and reg. The code change would allow us a little more flexibility in high-demand areas, but also mixed-use areas. The RPP ordinance is about the same ordinance that you see all over the country. It's based out of the 50s or 60s. There was a Supreme Court decision out of Alexandria or Arlington, Virginia, that held up the fact that you can prioritize residents or non-traffic generator uses from that traffic generator. It was created for the hospital, the football stadium, the warehouse that was impacting an adjacent neighborhood. Times have changed. We have mixed-use areas. We have areas that you have live-work units. You have people operating businesses out of their home, whether it's professional services, a salon, what have you. We want to have a little more flexibility as we go to other parts of the city to issue permits to different types of users, all governed by a rule and regulation that clearly prioritizes resident parking permit holders. We are not doing away with the RPP program as part of that change in the code. We've gotten a lot of feedback on that. But just to set the record straight, it offers flexibility. It does not change the RPP program. The rules and regs are what govern that system. We are revising those. They're on the website for everyone to look at. Those are the ones that govern who's eligible, how many permits, what the fees are.
All right, this question is, how will the 80% full average rate be calculated? I.e., is it by day, by week, by month, the time of day? How do you determine 80%?
So we're going to take, and this is in the plan detail sheet, we're going to take baseline counts between 3 and 5 a.m., and we're going to take an evening peak time, which is going to be 7 to 9 p.m. We feel like that's probably a good starting place. And we'll be collecting that LPR data, and we'll be extracting that LPR data and saying, okay, on average, are we achieving the 60 to 80%? It's going to be a blended average because we're not going to do a day in time now. With LPR, we're going to be able to take a month's worth, 2 months worth. It will, by doing that, you get rid of all the anomalies, bad weather, playoff game, holiday, what have you, and you have a blended average rate. And we're basing it off those small averages, 2 to 3 block area. I fully expect us to change rates out the onset in some of these areas. I also fully expect us to lower rates in some areas, just based on the data. We'll be using LPR, it'll be a blended average, but we'll be looking at those baseline counts, 3 to 5 a.m., are actually probably more like 2 to 3, because that's when we're out on the street, and then the 7 to 9 p.m.
So back to the map, why can't Dennison Place be included in either zone S&D or SNA?
That's a great question. So when we got the feedback about, we got feedback that north of 5th Avenue, there's different parking demand, and you had OSU. So because of that, we did not want to just extend our inner zones and outer zones north, because then you had a situation where someone that lived near Goodale Park could use their permit to get closer to school, closer to the football game. That's what we heard from the planning summits. I sat down at tables and people said, hold on, I've got the south side of, sorry, I'm a very visual person here. So you've got the south side here, and if you include them, they can use their permit to go to Gateway, to do whatever they want to do up here. You're going to end up leaving this group out to dry because there's other parking demand issues up here other than High Street. It's the campus. That's why we split it at 5th. Again, we got a lot of feedback on include this area, split it here, make these 2 different zones. I want to give this an opportunity to work. I want to give it 6 months. I want to see, we're going to be able to know how our permit users using their parking in the area. I do not foresee an issue where people here are going to go here and vice versa unless they have to. I think this area is going to have great protection because these areas will not be able to park there unless they pay. I'm confident that's going to work. I also want to give this 6 months to see if that zone boundary needs to be tweaked.
Staying there for a second about Dennison, this resident wants to know, they're deeply concerned about having to cross High Street from the purple area. Why would you force Dennison Place or Wyland Park to cross High Street?
Yeah, and I mean, first off, we're not forcing anyone to cross High Street. Again, I'll just go back to the previous response of when we first met with all of our task force members, the old zones, 9 to 10, they were oriented this way. We decided to orient it on the major traffic generator, High Street. That's why we're more of a north-south orientation until we get to 5th, because that's OSU. It's a different system. It's, again, my belief, and based on feedback, people were a little concerned that, one, permit holders would come down here and hang out at the cap, but conversely, an OSU student, someone wanting to go to the football game, could use their permit and inundate this area. So we wanted to confine that permit prioritization. We didn't want cross-pollination north-south. We were more comfortable east-west. It's not my firm belief that most people are going to have to cross High one way or the other to have parking. That being said, it gives people the option. We could have cut it here. We cut it right there. Again, we want to see how that plays out. Right now, our current permit zones are much smaller than that. So regardless, permit holders will have a little extra flexibility. Some existing permit holders are living on an island. They're probably a block or two, and that's it. So they have protection on the block or two, which helps them sometimes. But then off of that, there's no protection. They fall right off the cliff. Now there's a broader area for permit holders. I'm a firm believer this is a better option than what we have now. I'm a firm believer that this Dennison Place in particular won't see much of a change at all in terms of the permit demand. And we are doing a uniform restriction, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. permit only.
I think we addressed the privacy issues. This person wants to know, will this and when will it go citywide?
So the mobile app will go citywide in 2019. Once we get Short North, to get this plan implemented, we'll stay here. We're staying here for the long term. Every 3 months, we're changing something after the 6-month stabilization. We're also working with Children's Hospital area to establish a district. That would be virtual permitting. That'd be a much different restriction because they have different challenges. They have hospital employees. We have to solve for one thing. Here, there's there's endless user groups we have to try to solve for. We've also started engaging German Village. We're going to work with them starting in June to start looking at their permit program. They have a very fragmented permit district. We're going to be working in other areas of the city. Not any one area is going to look the same. When we go to University Area Commission and start talking to them about the University District, where we have an equally as fragmented system, it could look different than this. Virtual permits, 2020 is probably when we're going to cut off all stickers and hang tags. For the time being, every other area of the city will continue with stickers and hang tags because we wouldn't have bought enough LPR units to go citywide. By 2020, we feel like we'll have the funding to be able to go citywide.
Will garages be listed as available parking in the app?
That's a great question. We're going to have to work with our vendor to determine if that can happen. We're definitely going to make sure that it's an option, whether we know it's available or not. That's a great point. We need to try to figure that out as much as we can. If they're different vendors, sometimes you got to get them in a room and have them play nice.
Question says, I'm sorry. Given the 10 p.m. deadline, drivers will be able to spend more time in area bars and return to their cars much later. So why is the city seeming to encourage increased opportunity for drunk driving?
First of all, we can't engineer our system out of all those other things. We have wrong way drivers. At some point, there's personal responsibility. I don't think we're encouraging that any more than we aren't right now. I will say that at a 10 p.m. permit restriction, that means you're out of the neighborhood. If it's 10:05 and you're still parked there, you're going to get a ticket. On your second violation, we're going to tow your car. So in my mind, most visitors will probably start rolling off the street in the 8 to 9 hour, because I'm not sure why you'd park in the neighborhood unless you're visiting a resident at 9 o'clock just to walk down a high street and then have to get back at 10 o'clock. I'm not a believer we're incentivizing that anymore or less than we are now.
This resident wants to know why create an extremely dangerous and unsafe situation with parking on both sides of the street, particularly in the areas of south of Buttles on Denison. It's a racetrack for those cutting through Goodale.
So that's Denison Avenue, adding parking, Denison from Star down through the park. I'm a firm believer that parking on both sides of the street slows down traffic. Will someone always try to speed? Yes, just like someone's always going to try to not drive when they should. I'm a firm believer that narrowing the street with parking spaces is going to slow down traffic. I'm also convinced, so right now we actually have parking on both sides. It's a one-way street, and we're not going to turn Denison into one-way. We have a one-way configuration south of Poplar where we have parking on both sides. We didn't create one-way because of parking. We created one-way because of the intersection with Goodale and the highway ramp. Right now, those cars sit there. We have no restriction on the park side of Denison. Cars sit there. They can sit there for days on end. Trash, litter, other things that happen with that. Now we're going to have a 3-hour paid parking restriction that's going to create significant turnover, I think significant access for the park, but also significant access for permit holders. Now permit holders will be able to park on either side of the street. Our traffic division would not give the okay if we didn't believe that it's both safe because of the traffic volume standpoint and that it wouldn't encourage people to slow down as well as make parking more available. The other thing I heard is don't put meters up against the park. I agree. It's going to be mobile pay only, and we're going to look at in the future year probably pulling the meters on the other side of Goodale to create more of that park scene. It'll be mobile pay only. So we're going to look at doing that across a lot of parts of the city where maybe meters aren't heavily utilized or it just doesn't make sense to put a single space meter in the ground. We're going to reevaluate this. We're going to look at this. I can guarantee you if we see crashes go up or if we see something change, we will reevaluate that. Any street is up for discussion in terms of do we have parking on it, do we not have parking on it, speed limit, four-way stops. I've gotten a lot of questions about stops. Give us that feedback. I send it off to traffic. They do warrant studies to determine should there be a four-way stop or a two-way stop.
This question says, based on your projections, what will the negative financial impact to the city be as residential demand weakens in the area, subsequently decreasing property value?
So I am a firm believer that, well, first of all, we've created a benefit district. I would not have gotten the go-ahead from my leadership if I was going to have to ask for a handout after this. Third shift enforcement is something that no other parts of the city get. This type of active enforcement is something even downtown doesn't get. So the numbers work in our favor to actually implement this. Because if the numbers didn't work, I would have come back and said, I know we need third shift enforcement. I know you want third shift enforcement. I can't afford third shift enforcement. I am not convinced that property values will be diminished at all by this. I've worked in enough cities to know that, yes, restricted parking, there are pros and cons to this, absolutely. But I've talked to enough realtors and have enough realtor friends in different markets that, yes, it's an inconvenience at times because we're putting in a permit program, which clearly I think people realize we need here, but it's not to the detriment of property values. I think what people need to start knowing when they move into the community and not being sold a bad sale of goods is you need to have a permit. You can't just park on the street. Employees just can't park unfettered access. Large multi-unit buildings, when they're leasing up properties, people need to stop saying, oh, just go park on the street. You're not going to be able to do that anymore. I'm not giving permits to those buildings. So I think that's the bigger discussion we need to have with, say, the realtor community is how do we educate people? I'm not a believer that this is going to be detrimental to property values. Our interest as a city is to not have a detrimental effect on residents and employees. I know that is something that I just moved here in November from Colorado. I know there's been a lot of history here. I can say, though, I have not been tasked with having a detrimental effect on property values, killing business, making life miserable for people. I've been tasked with increased access for as many people as possible, create some balance, and create something that works. And we firmly believe that this works.
This question may be for us as well as you. Why did you schedule this meeting in direct conflict with the Victorian Village Commission meeting?
That's a great question. So we did not look at commission meetings, and I will say if it wasn't for a certain agenda item on that commission meeting tonight, that wouldn't have been a question. We didn't know. We actually, at the time we scheduled this, that was not on the agenda. We actually thought about asking the commission to push that agenda item back. We felt like because this was as much a Q&A session and not another feedback session, this is the final plan moving forward, that we didn't feel we had to revise it. I'll also say we've gotten a lot of feedback from that group, and we strategically met with some of those commissioners just to say, what do you think about the plan, especially the task force members who couldn't be here tonight, two in particular who've been very vocal about this. Talked to them beforehand just to get their feedback on it. It was not meant to lessen the group. I think we had a really amazing turnout tonight.
This is more of a comment. This resident says, we are a business owner. We're a small business and have 10 employees and over 100 clients. We cannot afford the employee permit prices.
So fees are put in place as a recognition there's value to these streets, there's value to this permit program. I do not anticipate a lot of employers buying that 10th permit. One thing to consider, you can have multiple plates on that permit. Do not think about it as one vehicle to one permit relationship. You have multiple on there, just make sure they're not in the same zone at the same time. And if they are, make one of the people pay the app for an hour or two. I don't think a lot of people will take that 10th. It is a recognition that parking is expensive. Employers have been able to rely on the on-street parking for a long time. We're now restricting that. We hope with our employee parking benefit fund, transportation benefit fund, we're working with our partners on, we can give you options. Discounted bus passes, discounted car share, ride share validations. We got to start thinking differently about, no, not every employee has to drive to work. We have to give people options so that they're not always just relying on the permit program. The fees are put in place to help balance the need for resident parking as well as an employee parking. It's an option, but there are also other options beyond the parking space. So based on the information we got about the average employee base, we felt like providing 10 was enough for most. The fee, again, I'd want to talk to you afterwards about do you even need 10? What do the shifts look like? And then what other options can we provide? I'm not convinced with any of this. We're going to have places where we issue more permits than parking spaces. Someone mentioned hunting license at a previous meeting. It becomes a hunting license in some situations, hopefully not all the time, but in some situations. How do we also fold in other mobility options? Right now, I continue to get feedback that we have to find a parking solution to a parking problem. I think we have to find access solutions to an access problem. And I think our mobility fund we're going to set up so that employers can buy down the cost of other modes can get people thinking differently about, maybe I don't need 10 permits, I only need a couple because they're not on a transit line, but others are, or they can use rideshare, car-to-go, other things.
This is a question regarding the task force. Did the committee reach a unanimous decision? I'm not sure on which element. And then who supported the plan and who rejected it?
No one had consensus on anything. I'll say the biggest contentious issue was the permit-only start time. We kind of came to a point at like 9:30 at night where we said, okay, we're done talking about this, and now it's staff's decision. So that's where we landed on the 10 p.m. That's where we landed on all of these. I will say we had proposed all these solutions, and I'd say about 90% of them we carried forward to this presentation. There's about 5-10% that we changed. We got some clarity on the number of permits. We got some clarity on, we got a lot of clarity on the zones, actually. It's probably the number one thing we got clarity on. We got clarity on the employee permits, although we adjusted the fees down. Our original fee structure was much more expensive than what you see today, so thank you to the business side of the task force that voiced those opinions. The restriction, no one, it was a stalemate.
There's questions about business permits. And customers. Why are patrons, businesses, and commercial property owners considered stakeholders on streets where they're not located?
Just as much as I think we're all stakeholders in this area. These are public streets at the end of the day. And again, if we were to find the data to show that that map was all red, we'd had a much different discussion than what we're having this evening. These are city streets. We are prioritizing permit holders in certain areas, and we're using different tools. One is a permit-only restriction. That's a new thing for this plan. We're also using pricing. We're using time limits. It is a recognition that if there's capacity on these streets, we're going to use it. Not to the point that we're inundating neighborhoods, but that map, that there are some areas that have pain points, and we're going to address that with the plan. There's other areas that don't. So we're trying to make that whole map green or yellow. We don't want red in other things. The other thing to talk about is this is an area that has been built up over time. This is an area that a lot of this area was built before the automobile. It's a recognition that with our small businesses, and that's why we have a permit program, you see the permits are only good till 8 p.m. That means your late night entities are not going to use those permits. That's not going to be, yeah.
And first of all, I think you've done a great job with this program, and I think a lot of us, living in these urban neighborhoods.
My only clarifying question for the rest of you.
At the end of the day, everybody's used to it. This is a big change for everybody. Everybody's used to permit parking.
This is a big change. I will agree.
But I think everybody here needs to recognize that, remove the employee. This guy has solved probably 90% of the problem. And I guess the question that my fear is, and I think you've done a great job, and I think you've worked really hard in good faith. I think most people believe that. I think the fear here is that, as Short North develops, we've changed. We're worried about having a remedy, right? Because the traditional remedy is you've got your block, you get to take care of it. But it doesn't appear that, it's been, instead of going to city council to vote for the plan and the residents, that's the parking code change where.
So is there a question in there? I've got to get you to a question.
No. The question is the parking code changes residential permit parking to permit parking. The city doesn't distinguish between a city street and a residential street. So it feels hostile as the city is taking over the parking and changing all the rules of protection. Again, I think you've done a great program. The question is that, this whole philosophy that the neighborhood streets belong to the commercial district and it's a shared stakeholder type of thing is very unsettling.
And I don't think, thank you for the comments. One, I do not believe with this plan that we have said commercial interests trump resident interests. Our plan, again, we're using different tools. There's different solutions out there. We have committed to 60 to 80% occupancy. We are prioritizing permit holders. We've introduced a permit-only restriction. It is a recognition that if there is some capacity, we want this area to thrive. And I'll tell you, this is becoming a more mixed-use area. Now, I'll say that's not a parking thing. I mean, my world is within the curb. But because there are all these other uses happening in the neighborhood, we did not feel compelled to do, say, a permit only and completely restrict the neighborhood because, one, there's other uses happening, but also there's capacity. I can appreciate the fact we've gotten a lot of comments. We've struck the word residential from the code. I can see just from that, without knowing anything else, that's an affront to residential neighborhoods. That was not the intent whatsoever. The intent, number one, that code our rules and regs are governed by that code, and that code is pretty vague anyway. The rules and regs is where the meat of this lives, and that rule and reg prioritizes resident permit holders. Absolutely. That's why we put so many more limitations on other permit uses in the neighborhood, except for residential. We are changing the code.
These are all specific.
We have struck residential. We've made it permit parking areas, and then in districts instead of maybe residential districts.
All right, we're going to have to move, Robert, but I'm happy that you guys can certainly connect after this. Folks, we got 3 more questions. These are very specific to individual properties. We want to make sure you're respectful of the space, but folks are going to be around after the meeting if you have some additional questions for just a few minutes. This particular is about the Wellness Center on Neal Avenue. We have 3 parking spaces behind our building for our clients, but often have 4 clients. How can they park and not get charged?
So this will be on Neal Avenue.
Yes, between 4th and 5th.
I'd like to talk to that person afterwards for the sake of time because that was pretty unique if they're
These
still
are
here.
all specific.
Yeah.
In this instance, business on Hubbard with 10 rental spaces. Each of the renters will want a parking space in SNA. Are there options to appeal the limit of 4 SNA spaces for pre-existing use from 2008?
Pre-existing use. So we still need to define what a 2009 mean. I'd be interested to talk to that person as well. Once we have the property eligibility map up later on this summer on the website, we'll have it at the workshop. That'll clear some things up. We are defining, we have some change of uses. Great historic preservation, I think people like that. Where do those fall in the pre-09, post-09? Again, if it's pre-09, it doesn't matter how many units. We're going to be offering permits, and it's going to be the same platform as the smaller unit buildings.
This is an example about employee permit use with the example of Westminster Thurber. Would their employees be allowed to purchase employee permits?
I'll have to get more information on that use after the fact, yeah.
Very good.
Handicap parking spot, thank you. So handicap parking spot, 1, ADA signage, which our team gets those applications. So if you meet certain requirements, we will install ADA signage in front of your house. That is above and beyond all restrictions. So you don't have to have a permit there, you don't have to pay there. ADA is kind of a sovereign space. That being said, I want to go back to the code changes. There were 2 exemptions from the residential parking permit language. 2 groups could be exempt from parking permit restrictions: commercial maintenance trucks and those with ADA placards. We are recommending to strike that language because we feel like there's a population with ADA and they should have parking. But for a group that doesn't live in the neighborhood, doesn't have a permit in the neighborhood, for them to be able to get free parking, unfettered access, free parking in the neighborhood, to then go to Short North, whatever, for as long as they want, we felt like we're doing all this work to restrict parking and trying to come up with some kind of balance, and then this whole group, which is a growing group, to have a placard to just park there. We have asked council as part of the code changes, and there's a public hearing on Wednesday about this, to strike that exemption. ADA would, if you find an ADA space, you could park there, no payment, no permit. If you don't have an ADA space and you have a placard, you would be required to fall under the guidelines, which is have a permit, park up to 3 hours with a payment, or you could park at a meter. And we do grant people additional time at the meter, and that's in our city code. It's 2 hours in addition. If you have an ADA space out front, this doesn't change it. We're going to change 2,000 signs in the neighborhood. What we're not going to change is any ADA parking. Those remain. And we do have an application process for that. We've always had a process, but now we've been a little more transparent about it. So please go on our website. We have an application to fill out if you need that.
Robert, just to clarify, this is our final question. This is in the instance of a visitor, I believe. With the 3-hour parking restriction, in the scenario where I want to visit a friend's house, go to business, go to church, Does it mean that after 3 hours, I need to drive blocks away to find another spot in another zone and then have to walk back to where I was spending my time?
It would, the 3-hour limit in the neighborhood is to prioritize permit holders, but it gives some flexibility, both permit holder guests as well as others if they can find a space. It is not meant for long-term parking. After 3 hours, you would be forced to, you would not be able to pay additional time on the app. You'd have to move into another zone. That being said, if you know someone who lives in the neighborhood who has a validation, you get a validation from them and you can park as long as you want, or, sorry, 24 hours. Or if it's the first guest permit, maybe they'll let you park there all year. I don't know. That'll be up to the resident account holder to do that. So.
Thank you, Robert, for being here. Long presentation tonight. We are going to get ready to close it there, but we will be available. The website is still open to you if you do have additional comments. Those questions that were more specific in nature will get responses, and those will be posted as well. So Robert will be responding to those. Folks, thank you for hanging in there tonight and throughout this process and for being here. We appreciate it.